Hello, everyone. My name is Tali Kritzman-Amir. I'm a visiting assistant professor at Boston University, and on behalf of the BU International Law Journal, I want to welcome you to our workshop on Fortress North America. The motivation for this workshop stems from a sense that we're seeing a process of turning North America into a citadel against immigration through a series of law and policy measures, utilizing media, technology, military, politics, and the courts. And we thought it would be a good idea to look at these measures in their totality, in a comparative perspective, and through the lens of international law. Since we started planning this workshop in the fall and until today, some of these measures have been retracted, but some have not. We see this workshop as an opportunity to reflect on past measures, some of which were the creation of the former administration and have died with it, but some have been with us from before and continue to exist under the new administration. And it's also an opportunity to look forward as the Biden administration's immigration reforms unfold. The workshop will include 5 sessions, 3 today and 2 tomorrow. In each session, a discussant will start us off presenting the paper and offering some points of critique, and then the contributor will respond, and then we will open it up for questions. Finally, I'd like to thank the moderators, contributors, and commentators, Nate and Matthew, who support us on the back end, Elizabeth, Jeremy, and another Elizabeth for their administrative assistance, the American Society of International Law, Immigration Law Interest Group for the co-sponsorship of this event, and last but not least, the co-organizers of this event, our fearless editor-in-chief, Tyler Hennigan, and my wonderful colleague, Professor Daniela Caruso. And I'll pass the baton now to Tyler.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tyler Hennigan. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Boston University International Law Journal, and I wanted again to give you a virtual welcome to BU School of Law. And I also wanted to acknowledge all of Tali's hard work. She's really been the one that's put all of this together. So a round of applause to her. She's been fantastic in taking the reins on this. And I also just want to say that the papers that you're going to hear today will culminate in BU ILJ's 40th volume for the incoming e-board that we just elected last week. So thanks again for everyone that's contributed. And I hand it over to the discussants and the moderators.
Great, welcome. Oh, go ahead.
It's okay, yep. My name's Nick Masinski. I'll be moderating the panels this morning. I'm a visiting researcher at the Center for Study of Europe at Boston University. So the first panel today, we have Professor Jacqueline Baba, who is FXB Director of Research, Professor of Practice of Health and Human Rights at the Harvard School of Public Health, and Jeremiah Smith Lecturer in Law at Harvard Law School. Her paper is titled Penetrating the Fortress, the Imperative of Sustaining Frontline Empathy for Distressed Migrants Instead of Destroying It. Our discussant this morning is Julie Dahlstrom, who directs BU Law's Immigrants' Rights and Human Trafficking Program. Tali already told us about the format, the 20 minutes, then 10 minutes, then open up for questions. But if you are interested in asking a question, please use the raise hand function. I think it's at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we'll call on you and unmute you at that point. We plan to end each session about 5 minutes before the hour so that we can take a short break before the next one. So now I'll hand it over to Julie.
Great, thanks so much, Nick, and sorry to cut you off. I'm just so eager to engage. So thank you to the BU International Law Journal for organizing this important workshop and webinar, and particular, as was mentioned, to the conference organizers, Daniela Caruso, Tali Kritzman-Amir, and Tyler Hennigan, as well as to the International Law Interest Group, Immigration Law Interest Group. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen quickly. Here we go. Okay. As everyone knows, and as Tali mentioned, the Symposium on Fortress North America comes at an incredibly pivotal time. We are in the wake of the Trump administration's commitment to harsh migration controls, externalization of the border, and rigid enforcement practices. We are amidst a global pandemic as COVID-19 has provided a new justification for policies of exclusion and xenophobia. And we're amidst, in this country, greater public outcry about structural racism and state violence against historically marginalized groups, including immigrants. And thus, this conference is important as a call for creative reimagining of migration possibilities at a moment where there is so much at stake. So for that reason, I have the distinct pleasure of commenting on Professor Baba's paper, Penetrating the Fortress, the imperative of sustaining frontline empathy for distressed migrants instead of destroying it. Professor Baba, as many of you in this audience know, teaches at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health and is a leading voice and scholar in the migration space. She's published extensively on issues of transnational child migration, refugee protection, child rights and citizenship. And I have had this distinct pleasure of watching her magic in the classroom and been able to guest lecture with her and watch her teach and teach me about migration. So I'm really it's a pleasure for me to be able to comment on her paper because she is such a tremendous scholar in this space. The paper insightfully explores how frontline host communities shape individual migration experiences, as well as regional and national immigration policies. And in particular, Professor Baba explores the potential of empathy as a means to counteract some of the fortress tendencies that we'll address today. She also points to the absence of empathy as a driving force for more rigid, harsh immigration policies throughout North America. And ultimately, she posits that empathy can help to ensure a, quote, welcoming and humanizing experience for distressed migrants. So as you can see, it's a hopeful and incredibly ambitious project. So my remarks today will focus on two particular points. One, why Professor Baba's paper is especially important now in the context of transit migration. These frontline communities, as migrants are in transit, are particularly at risk for an empathy deficit, as research has shown, and a space where legal rights claims are particularly tenuous. Thus, as Professor Baba suggests, the absence or presence of empathy in frontline communities can have an important role in shaping the individual migrant's experience and also immigration policies. And second, I'll focus on the power and limits of empathy as a concept. Professor Baba asks us how frontline communities can cultivate empathy and how this may shape migration policies. And I'll focus on a couple of questions that arise in response. Are there certain conditions in frontline communities that can either foster or destroy empathy? Can empathy be taught or cultivated? And finally, what are the limits of empathy in driving discourse and rights? Scholars, artists, and activists have long sought to cultivate empathy as a driver of action in the migration context. And here's just one example. In 2018, at the Tate Modern, Cuban artist and activist Tania Bruguera sought to draw attention to the migration crisis in North America using, quote, forced empathy and other so-called stealth interventions to provoke action. She harnessed the senses of touch, smell, and sight to connect the audience to the plight of refugees, including, for example, a young refugee from Syria who in the exhibition, the picture was concealed initially from visitors who had to act collectively, lying on the floor and touching to heat it up, after which the photo remained visible only for 15 minutes. The exhibition asked the audience to consider the role of empathy in motivating action and to examine very viscerally how empathy is cultivated and its role in responding to migration crises. Catherine Wood, the senior curator at the Tate Modern, said of the artist's intentions, she wants us as viewers to be put in an uncomfortable position like the subjects of the work. At the same time, it's a call to action in a very positive way. Baba's piece, just like this artist's exhibit, asks us, like at the Tate, to consider empathy's role in relationship to migration policy and responses. So you might be asking, what is empathy? Scholars and philosophers have offered distinct and different concepts of empathy, and Baba defines empathy as, quote, democratic solidarity, an engagement with the situation of another as an equal, as a fellow human, including when the human being enters and stays in our space. Distinct from a commitment to human rights norms, from charity or from sympathy, she points to Howard Hassman's working definition, which notes that empathy is the capacity to put oneself in another's shoes and to recognize a stranger's humanity. How does Professor Baba's concept of empathy connect to migration scholarship? You know, as she and others have raised, while this focus on frontline communities is novel, scholars have long considered how concepts akin to empathy intersect with migration. Immanuel Kant in 1795 introduced this principle of hospitality as a key component of the law of world citizenship. He defined hospitality as, quote, the right of a stranger not to be treated as an enemy when he arrives in the land of another. The stranger should not be treated with hostility, according to Kant, as long as he peacefully occupies his place. However, this concept for Kant was limited. It was not extended to permanent visitors. He was primarily concerned with the right of temporary sojourn, the right to associate, which all people have. And others, as this audience knows, have built on this concept. Derrida, for example, drawing on the work of Levinas, built upon Kant's notion of hospitality and defined hospitality as inviting and welcoming the stranger. He noted how this concept of welcoming can occur on multiple levels, the micro and the macro, but it was a limited concept. He notes, quote, an essential self-limitation built right into the idea of hospitality preserves a distance between one's own and the stranger, between owning one's own property and inviting the other into one's home. Thus, there was the distinction between welcoming into one's own home and giving them your home. And Celia bin Habib further explored these ideas with regard to migration and cosmopolitanism. Bin Habib extends Kant's vision, arguing that the human right of hospitality should not apply to the single visit, but in some cases, long-term stays, and have been the basis for important migration concepts like non-refoulement. So thus, Professor Baba's piece provides a new opportunity to engage with the concept of hospitality, to consider its connection to empathy, and to explore its role in frontline communities. The context of frontline communities is particularly important now because it's a space in transit migration where empathy can be particularly difficult to cultivate. Scholars have long focused on transit migration, sought to expand traditional approaches to migration, which puts migrants in narrow categories, and examines how the migrant and refugee communities may live in transit for years, a condition that both impacts destination countries and the migrants themselves. Other scholars in the EU context, some of them participating in this workshop, have built upon these concepts, defining transit migration as, quote, a phase of experienced immobility in the process of movement in a specific migratory direction. And they pointed to the rise of transit migration in the EU, where migrants en route to final destinations often find travel in a nonlinear pathway, where they encounter increased migration controls and barriers as the border has been outsourced and securitized. And others have written persuasively about this phenomenon in North America. Baba focuses on these frontline communities in transit migration and calls us to examine their essential role in shaping both individual migrant experience and larger macro level legal and policy responses. And we don't have to look far to see the impact of frontline communities on migration policy. In 2019, for example, media outlets highlighted the role of frontline communities in Mexico, which were increasingly hostile to migrants, refugees, and others en route from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and other host communities. For many onlookers, this was a radical departure from the warm welcome that had been extended to migrants in some Mexican communities historically. For example, in 2019, a Chiapas town provided 300 migrants with food and support, allowing them to sleep in the main square and 5 temporary shelters. Quote, all we can do is welcome them and have empathy, as city residents said of the migrants who were sleeping in his town. However, as this group knows, xenophobia has increased under the former Trump administration. The responses of frontline communities has shifted. Mexican towns began to grow more and more hostile towards migrants. And as an example, in 2019, one town effectively developed its own exclusionary policies, trying to block 2,000 migrants from entering the town, telling residents to close their shops and remain inside their homes. As frontline communities have grown more hostile and less empathetic to migrants, so also have Mexican general attitudes about immigration. Towards the end of 2019, 64% of Mexicans, nearly 2/3, did not view migrants positively, versus just 33% who believed Mexico should give them temporary asylum or residency, and only 7% supported settlement permanently. Professor Baba's paper responds to these developments by drawing attention to how frontline communities, such as those in Mexico, can play a significant role in shaping national migration policy, either negatively or positively. She posits that empathy, connection between home communities and migrants, can be a key factor in ensuring a more humane, compassionate response to migration. And conversely, the lack of empathy can lead to increasingly restrictive, harsh immigration policies. Why is her focus on frontline communities important? Research has shown that frontline communities, while migrants are in transit, can be a site where empathy is especially hard to cultivate. There can be physical or geographic barriers that separate migrants from residents. There are reduced opportunities for repeated social interactions that can result in reinforcing rather than dispelling stereotypes. For example, in a recent paper entitled Exposure to Transit Migration, Public Attitudes and Entrepreneurship, authors found that exposure to transit migration increases prejudice and anti-foreigner sentiment. They studied this in the EU, where they found that, quote, it reduces trust in institutions, increases the aversion to risk, and decreases entrepreneurship. Also, the impermanence of migrant communities, or at least perceived impermanence, can be an obstacle to empathy. One scholar noted that in the EU, quote, transit migrants are merely seen as individuals who are not there to settle. It becomes easier to dehumanize and to increase the distance between us and them, or passing the buck to other countries in terms of care and protection. And in addition, as Tali has raised, social media and misinformation campaigns in some cases have undermined the potential for empathy and solidarity. As an example, in Tijuana, a city known as a city of migrants, incidents of violence and anti-immigrant sentiment have proliferated, in part due to misinformation. Recently, a violent confrontation erupted, resulting in physical violence and epithets. And Claudia Benassini, a researcher at La Salle University, attributed that violence to fake news on social media, which significantly contributed to the incident. These trends, of course, come against a backdrop of rising nationalism, anti-immigrant sentiment, and xenophobia, which have increasingly polarized individuals and made it more difficult to cultivate empathy. So amidst these conditions, it's unsurprising that we see an empathy gap, and this is what makes Professor Baba's work particularly timely and important. And so now I want to turn just briefly to the power and limits of empathy in addressing this gap. What role can empathy play? Researchers and philosophers have long recognized the power of empathy in driving human connection and action. In recent years, research in the fields of philosophy, neuroscience, and other fields has proliferated on empathy. For example, Helen Rice, in a book entitled The Empathy Effect, examined how empathy impacted healthcare and found that in frontline workers, empathy improved both patient and doctor health. And that was in contrast to what some expected, that emotional distance could help doctors to be more rational and objective in providing care. Researchers have also studied how to cultivate empathy. Daryl Cameron, for example, a professor at Penn State, in his research has found that empathy can be boosted by changing how individuals think about it. Cameron observed that, quote, if our goal is to inspire more empathy, to bridge social divides, then maybe knowing how and why people sometimes choose not to feel it could suggest a lever for pushing people in the opposite direction to choose empathy. In one study, he convinced participants that empathy would be emotionally rewarding instead of just exhausting, and made participants more likely to humanize someone experiencing substance abuse issues. In another study, or in an earlier study, participants had greater empathy for mass suffering when they were convinced that it would not cost them financially. And he observed it's easy to think that people might avoid empathy because they just don't want to feel bad. But what if it's because empathy is effortful, taxing, and fatiguing? It's hard work to try to get inside someone's head and feel what they're feeling. One might be afraid of getting it wrong or not knowing well enough to know what they are feeling. This fascinating research poses a number of questions for Professor Baba's project. If empathy is a choice and its cultivation a challenge, how can frontline communities and activists encourage its cultivation? Does this require the deployment of greater resources, greater education, greater training? And finally, her paper begs us to ask are there limits to empathy? Are there dangers of the over-reliance on empathy? Research has highlighted that empathy is an imperfect tool to compel action. Paul Bloom, who many of you may know, a psychology professor at Yale, in his book Against Empathy, argues that empathy can be a poor moral guide. He argued that the problems with empathy are, quote, innumerate, favoring the one over the many. It can spark violence. Our empathy for those close to us is a powerful force for war and atrocity towards others. He argued that we're hardwired to prefer the person we know over the stranger. He said, quote, we're not psychologically constituted to feel towards a stranger what we feel towards someone we love. We're not capable of feeling a million times worse about the suffering of a million than the suffering of one. And that's been echoed by others. Some, like Bloom, warn about the over-reliance on empathy and that it can lead to misdirected action and also a form of compassion fatigue that can lead to apathy. However, even Bloom acknowledges that at some level, empathy may be needed to promote action. A rational, detached compassion absent the motive to act is insufficient. Thus, a further question posed by this piece is, how do we take advantage of the positive qualities brought by empathy while avoiding some of these pitfalls? And finally, but not unexpected given the audience we have, how, if at all, should empathy shape legal decision-making and policy development? Somewhat out of the scope of Professor Baba's paper, but how do we consider empathy's role in motivating adjudicators and policymakers as they engage in lawmaking or decision-making? More recently, attention has been paid to whether empathy should impact judicial decision-making. Former President Obama famously observed when speaking about the key components of judicial decision-making, quote, the critical ingredient is supplied by what is in the judge's heart in terms of making decisions. Others have disagreed, famously Justice Sotomayor, who famously said, it's not the heart that compels conclusion in cases, it's the law. So is there a role for empathy to play in decision-making? We've seen concepts like solidarity or fraternity migrate into migration law. And is there a place for empathy to inform legal concepts related to migration? So in conclusion, Baba's piece asks us to consider new directions for research on empathy in frontline communities in the migration context. And it also highlights new engaging intersections between the fields of neuroscience, psychology, and migration that will undoubtedly add new important dimensions to this debate. So I very much look forward to hearing her comments into the discussion, and I'll turn it over to Professor Baba.
Julie, thank you for those magnificently rich and thought-provoking comments. And actually, I've just learned so much listening to you. So thank you for all the work you did on this very embryonic paper. So I think you captured really everything very well. Maybe I can just make a couple of comments, and actually these are not prepared. I thought I was going to read a section of my paper. Obviously I didn't get the instructions properly, but let me just say a couple of things and hope that people will have a chance to read you know, the draft that we've circulated. So the first is why frontline communities? Why am I talking about frontline communities rather than, you know, big conurbations, you know, the places where most immigrants live? And you touched on that very well. I think the issue for me is twofold. Firstly, I think that frontline reception is critical for distressed migrants, as I call them, refugees, forced migrants who are forced, as we know, as Tali said in her opening remarks, forced into increasingly dangerous journeys, increasingly hazardous, fractured, iterative routes to safety. And so they now, as we all know, many people are forced to land in very inhospitable, tough places after really arduous journeys, unnecessarily arduous and unnecessarily tough. And so the humanizing experience at that point is, I think, critical and under-attended to. Being welcomed, being remade to feel human and welcome rather than a pariah. Or being disappeared, as one of the excellent papers that we're going to discuss later said, it can be life-changing. And we know that again and again from personal testimony. There's so much, you know, so many qualitative nuggets that people have researched and shared about how migrants react. You know, a recent book by Chase and Alsop, some of you might have seen, about youth and well-being. It's an excellent new book about youth migration. They have several interviews with young people who talk enormously powerfully about what kind of welcome mentorship, that kind of human embrace has meant. And I think there's some interesting concepts about kind of touch and contact that we can actually draw on here, really, as you said, crossing fields, not our usual kind of domain as lawyers, but thinking about how we move away from distant contact and digital contact to actually human touch and what that means in a humanizing relationship. So that's one reason why I think frontline communities are important. But I also think that pragmatically and from a policy perspective, they are critical and perhaps neglected because, as you so nicely showed with some of those New York Times and other clips, frontline communities flip often for understandable reasons, not because demagogic media are evilly contaminating their minds, not because self-interested right-wing leaders are, you know, building on provoking xenophobia for their own political purposes. So both those factors, of course, play some part, but they are flipping because our current policies take that generosity for granted and abuse it. And I think this is a point that we've neglected at our peril as kind of, you know, advocates and maybe policymakers, that we need to think about nourishing generosity amongst host communities, because it is a valuable resource for policy. And we know that, you know, when you see an outpouring of popular kind of civic generosity and warmth, politicians are also emboldened, they're shamed into a position which is more generous than one that they might adopt. And conversely, when you see local people feeling threatened because, you know, the spaces that they inhabit are now overrun by desperate people without resources, and there's litter everywhere, and people don't have jobs, people don't know what their future is. So these spaces that were nourishing spaces are becoming unsafe spaces. People then start feeling that their own security is at threat, as is indeed the security of migrants. So I think that the policy implications of that are critical. We need to be saying in a much more forceful and careful way than we have how migration priorities need to think about responsibility sharing, how this needs to be embedded in the kind of policies, how instead of this massive investment in externalization, which is futile because people will find a way to protect their lives, how we need to invest in planning what we know is inevitable, which is continuing large-scale distress migration. This is not an accident. This is not a crisis. This is a continuum. And so we need to plan differently, and we need to be crafting policies which talk about anticipatory needs, not kind of reactive short-termism. So what I'm trying to do in this paper is to really push us to think about what the demands might be. For example, how can we have win-win policies so that reception is something which nourishes both the sense of welcome on behalf of refugees or other forced migrants on the one hand, and nourishes the sense of solidarity and kind of common humanity and a sense of well-being amongst the host community too. And I think we can use here some of the work that colleagues are doing in big cities to show how the shift from being a majority to being a minority for host populations has been beneficial, and how people are adjusting and actually welcoming a different sense of what their community is. And instead of being defensive about that, we can be proactive and say, you know, we are all of us now increasingly acknowledging we live in a much more diverse world, which is full of wealth and richness, but it needs to be nourished. So you know, on the one hand, yes, the welcome, the importance of that kind of physical touch and embrace for people who've been forced to endure so much unnecessarily. And on the other hand, the importance of anticipating need and thinking systematically what that would look like. I'll just make a couple of other points and then stop. One is that I think the UN, for example, UNHCR has recently, following a General Assembly 2018, I think, or 2019 General Assembly resolution, has started looking at the impact of arrival and, you know, burden sharing, they call it. We prefer responsibility sharing on host communities. And it's kind of I mean, in a way, it's a useful exercise, but the emphasis is on cost. What does it cost? What does it cost fiscally? What does it cost affectively? It's very much phrased in this kind of one-way sense that this is a burden, which brings with it certain costs, education costs, health costs, housing costs, completely neglecting the fact that this has a huge win-win potential. And without being Pollyannish, I think we need to talk about that. That's really our job now, to pull out that win-win aspect, you know, the demographic dividend, the skill dividend, the diversity dividend, the you know, the being part of a global community dividend, how our life, you know, has changed, as we all know, from this kind of narrow focus on this kind of one-to-one match between people and territory. We all know that stuff. So I think UNHCR, that exercise needs to be radically rethought, and we need to get away from talking about impact as cost only. Another point I think that's very important is to think concretely about what we mean by transit. And, you know, you picked up on that, Julie, I thought really, really in an interesting way. Transit is often not transient. And, you know, I think we now know, all of us who are migration scholars, that this kind of simplistic division between origin, transit, destination is now, you know, no longer an accurate reflection of mobility. And so transit may be transit, it may be, you know, very quick transit, so you kind of avoid the safe third country pitfall, but it may also become home, and we need to rethink how that works and what enables that to work. So if you think about Mexico, or you think about Greece, or you think about Sicily, or you think about Bangladesh, you know, for all the different refugee communities who are navigating new homes, what should policymakers be doing? How should we be thinking about refugee education, inclusive education? How should we be thinking about shelter and housing? How should resources be allocated away from border control and externalization and interception and repatriation and kind of all these massive amounts of funds that are being placed futilely into sending people home only for them to make an even more dangerous journey again, and reallocated to a more realistic appraisal of where people are going to live and make their lives. So I think that this is, I think, as far as I know, we're really at the beginning of this. We're at the beginning of being maybe more aggressive in our own insistence that this can be win-win. I think we've been defensive in often, you know, we know this going way back, say, well, their numbers are exaggerated and, you know, this is well, actually, let's get away from the crisis talk altogether. And I say this to myself, who's used that kind of phraseology. And let's look at a much more planned interventionist approach, which is, I think, broader. And this picks up on some of the excellent points in some of the papers too, you know, going beyond our current framework, which we have to do, I think, in many ways, our refugee framework and so on, to think more proactively about how this is going to pan out. Because ultimately, I think the restrictionists and the exclusionists are fighting a losing battle. That's a question of time before population movements reflect what the needs that people have, until, you know, global changes are much more radical. So I think this is important. I think you're absolutely right to also point to empathy's limitations. I don't want to be Pollyannish here. I don't want to think of, I don't think of empathy actually as a kind of fuzzy, sweet, I mean, I'm trying to distinguish empathy from charity, which I see as kind of top down, or sympathy, which is kind of transient, and think of this much more as a deep call on a sense of a common purpose here. But of course, it has its limitations, and without much more effective investment, without redistribution of assets, you know, we're going to continue to fail, and we're going to continue to find that, you know, this whole area provides very fertile ground for the growth of xenophobia. So I think, yeah, I think maybe I'll leave it at that. But Judy, thank you so much for the work you put in, and, you know, for really thinking about this with me. I'm really, really grateful. And thank you. I didn't even start by thanking Tali and everybody else, the colleagues, for this great opportunity. I think it's really wonderful to see these opportunities to think together, all of us. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Baba. That was great. And for Julie Dahlstrom, that was also wonderful comments. Now we're going to open it up to questions. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. We also have a few here, but please start raising your hand and we'll cycle through them. So first up, it looks like Susan Gazesh.
Hi, good morning. And hello, Jackie. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
I have three very brief comments. One is I teach Susan Sontag's text regarding the pain of others in my basic human rights course. And it's a wonderful text for undergraduate students to kind of start thinking about that. I also always use Jackie Baba's piece on internationalist gatekeepers, where she has the brilliant phrase of making distant wrongs into local rights, and it really sets this up nicely. So I'm eager to see what her current work is on it. My two substantive comments that I can contribute are my experience in Chicago, which is where I practiced law from 1980 till 2001, and now I've been at the university full-time since, is that the question of welcoming in urban communities, and I'm teaching a course on this next quarter, has to do, an important set of actors are immigrant communities that still retain a consciousness of what their prior history was. So in Chicago, Irish, Jewish, Japanese American, understanding when they were excluded, and this kind of cross-generational sense of solidarity. So I think that's an important area to look at in terms of who actors might be in the urban question. The other is, I'm pretty familiar with the situation in Mexico and teach about human rights in Mexico. And I want to suggest that some of what we're seeing in Mexico is really about church versus state. Almost all of the shelters across Mexico that have helped with the caravans and individuals and small groups coming from Central America through are church supported by different orders. The Jesuits and the Dominicans are particularly active. And Mexico's peculiar history, official history of anti-clericism dating from the Mexican Revolution, and the kind of current tensions right now between church-supported entities and the state, you know, that's another area where you might look to see who some of the significant players are. And also, I have to confess, I haven't read the papers yet, but the presentations were great, and I will send comments later. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to respond?
As you're in charge, Nicholas, so whatever you say, I'm happy to just make maybe a couple of comments, but I see there's some other hands up, so I don't want to take all the time. Thank you, Susan. I really, I'll go and look up the Susan Sontag piece that you reference, and the welcoming communities, and the fact that these communities themselves are often immigrant communities or second, third generation, you know, if you like, migrant background is a better way of describing them, because they may not experience themselves at all as immigrant anymore, is a very important point. And I think that maybe goes to the broader point that, you know, how we think about community and belonging and citizenship is always in evolving. And so to have this kind of static view of them and us is completely anachronistic as well as unproductive. So I agree with that comment. I know that people are doing work in Europe, showing, for example, that cities like, Vienna, Rotterdam, Antwerp, you name it, are now majority minority, i.e., either that there is no majority, so the majority are all minorities, or that the majority is what we used to think of as a minority. So the whole notion of who we are and what the city is changing. So thank you for that. I had not thought at all about the church-state point. It's a really interesting one. Maybe in the European context, which I guess I've thought about, and maybe a little bit more recently, the kind of Greek and Italian context, maybe this is less true, but maybe it is true actually, and I really need to look at that. So thank you for raising that. I think that's really interesting. And of course, the kind of whole theistic tradition informs our notion of empathy, as Julie was saying. So there is a kind of whole notion, though I think the Samaritan notion is of course very limited, because you're actually not taking someone into your home, you're helping them out there. It's a kind of a NIMBY approach, but yeah, thank you. I'll think about that some more, but really, really, really thoughtful comments. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next up, we have Tali.
Thanks, Jackie. That was such a great paper. And Julie, thank you so much. Those comments were just so enlightening. So I wanted to ask maybe one question about the relationship of empathy and the law, but maybe to approach it from a different direction than Julie. So I think Julie was essentially asking if maybe it is the responsibility of the court to apply empathy in its decision-making process. And I was thinking whether it's the responsibility of the court to encourage empathy among people. And I think Julie was sort of hinting at the Cédric Quérot case as sort of the paradigmatic example of that. And I think that's a great case to incorporate into your piece, because that's really where we're seeing the court actually, putting this idea into practice. So that's one thought. And then the other thought, or thoughts that I had, go to terminology, but I think they're a little bit broader and more, I guess it's more than terminology, in the sense it's a broader conceptual framework than that I would be suggesting. So one thought that I had was about the relationship of empathy and compassion, and how you think this notion of empathy corresponds to compassion fatigue that has been discussed so heavily in the field of refugee studies. And then the other terminological but yet conceptual comment was about the relationship, or the term that you've been using to characterize the moments of empathy of communities with migrants. You use the term encounters, and I was wondering whether those are actually relationships rather than encounters, to suggest something that has a broader context and is more ongoing. And I was also wondering if you think that empathy is formed at those moments of encounter, or is expressed in those encounters, and if you think that has any significance.
Thank you, Tali. This is just like a treat for me, because I've been thinking a lot about all this stuff on my own. So this is very, very helpful. So I'll follow up on the case, which actually I need to look at. So thank you for raising that. And I haven't really thought deeply enough about the court's responsibility or the law's responsibility. I mean, I think that in refugee law, in a way, we have a lot to work with. I mean, the whole notion of a well-founded fear is kind of based on a kind of a humanistic approach to human beings and to human frailty. And so surely that in some way does evoke this kind of relationship that I'm trying to get at. I think, in a way, you could say the whole humanitarian endeavor, the fact that we have a refugee convention, I mean, all the context for that is predicated on this sense of a common humanity and obligations. So that's the kind of framework in which all this has been developed. Of course, as people like Thomas Spicabo and others have pointed out, you know, it's not just World War II that's the original sin. We have lots of other original sins, which, you know, colonization, enduring post-colonial inequities, which underpin where we are now. So we need to look at that more broadly than just the post-World War II framework. But yes, I do think that so much international law is predicated on this notion of sort of bilateral obligation, which goes beyond kind of territorial and sovereignty-based notions of obligation. In terms of terminology, I think you're absolutely right. There is a lot of, there's quite a close, and some of the literature does use the word compassion rather than empathy. But you know, this is really kind of just thinking this out myself. I feel that what I'm looking for is something which is more horizontal and and bidirectional. And to me, compassion has a kind of a more hierarchical, a bit like charity, de haut en bas kind of feeling, and it is kind of very much seems to me to have more of a religious flavor. And I want to get into more kind of secular, state-driven set of obligations for building, you know, inclusive communities, which shouldn't depend on a kind of fixed positionality. I mean, I think that empathy actually does also has to go both ways. So we're talking about inclusion. We're talking about, as you say, a relational bond here, which is bi-directional, and you see that at its best in these situations. You know, we're all familiar with the stories about, you know, Canadian sponsors of refugees, what the sponsors got out of it, and how this kind of sense of having somebody new in your life is just so unbelievably enriching. The point about encounter, I mean, I've been hugely influenced, obviously, by Itamar's work and the notion of the humanitarian encounter, and have been rereading it and thinking about it in the context of this. And what I get from it particularly is the way in which the state drives the effort to minimize or eliminate encounter. And that's what I'm talking about. And I use this terminology that Padura uses, you know, this haptic and phatic. I mean, he uses these Greek words in a very kind of thoughtful way. So I reference that in the comments that I wrote. But how so much current digital technology is really emphasizing kind of contact at a distance, which is not touch. And so, yes, I think what I'm talking about is something which is more enduring. And I mean, enduring in the sense that it leaves a mark. It may have a short temporal span. So this is the point about transit and transient. You know, I think these, because you know, we've all seen this with colleagues, you know, people who have experienced this sense of engagement with arriving distressed migrants, value that experience enormously, and that sort of relationship endures even after, say, the person in question has moved or has left. So I think encounter and relationship are not mutually exclusive, and I think the profundity of the experience and its political potential as a kind of driver of progressive political policy making can really, that potential can exist even when the actual relationship endures only over a short period of time. But we are planning, I mean, I think it's probably pretty obvious from the paper, we're actually fundraising and trying to do some research, which actually does some data collection so that we anchor some of these insights, kind of, which are a little bit abstract, in actual experiences, asking people, policymakers and frontline community members, you know, how their positions changed and why over time, and so on, to get a better sense of how one might have some agency here.
Thank you. We have 4 minutes left, so I'm going to have Professor Nora Laurie ask the last question, and then you can respond.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I'm really sorry to be a disembodied voice. I've managed to leave my computer charger on campus. So I will join you soon in camera. And I couldn't really see Julie's slides, but I really appreciate how rich the conversation has been so far and how deep, both theoretically and also in terms of policy and law. And so I guess some people have asked empathy and different dimensions. I'm really interested in this transit is not transitory or transient, and what that means in policy and more importantly, infrastructure, these local communities. I have to say, I really appreciate that. I know you said like Pollyannish win-win. No, I think we need to be absolutely strategic, and I really appreciate that you're giving us a framing to talk to, power brokers, whether it's states or like some of these high net worth billionaires who are playing in this space, and thinking about where to direct funding and how to think about empowering and taking not reaching the limits of the empathy of these local communities. And in that way, I feel like your this paper is so different from other aspects of saying like empathy is so limited. I've seen Tom Farrer's migration integration book, where basically he says, empathy is limited, therefore we need to create these offshore screening sites effectively moving the border out. And you're saying empathy is limited, and that's why we need to think about these local communities and building them up. So I really appreciate that. In terms of transit is not transitory, what does it mean in terms of infrastructure and funding and what we should be thinking about in these frontline communities? I can think of like, okay, more permanent housing or schooling, or what does it look like for you?
Thank you so much for those comments. So I know we have very little time, so let me just say two things in response to this. I mean, thought-provoking points you made. One is, I'm just reading this wonderful book by this historian called Paul Betts, and the book is called Ruin and Renewal, and it's a history of post-World War II. And he shows how, after kind of the destruction, it's about Europe and the destruction of Europe, how the notion of helping these, people in, I think they had like, so many displaced persons, over 4 million, building a sense of collective endeavor to help to reintegrate, to humanize, became kind of like a redefinition of what civilization meant. Moving away from this idea that we've destroyed civilization, and what does European civilization even mean when you go through World War II, to thinking, well, this is a way to recapture a different sense of who we are and of what civilization means. And I think that's very useful for us too, to take kind of the high ground and to assert this ourselves. So this is actually part of defending who we are as a polity, as a set of polities. So, and much more to be said about that, but, not to concede the ground for saying, we're, like the Orbans of this world who have tried to appropriate that sort of space of defining what, our culture is and redefine it in a completely different way. The second, and I'm not the first to say that at all. There were people in the European Union who tried to do that in 2015, but I think it's kind of now subsided, and, that sense of aggressive self-confidence has given way to this kind of sheepish defensive-ness, and we need to change that, I think. But in terms of what would it look like, that's exactly the question that I think I'm thinking about. And I think what it looks like, first of all, is expecting that there are going to be these arrivals, not seeing this as a kind of as a kind of calamitous emergency, but as a new normal. Actually, not even that new normal. And saying, this is where we are, and people are going to continue arriving. And this is how we need, just like we invest resources in interception, people are, state actors expect to intercept. They don't say, oh my God, we now need to suddenly think, oh, how are we going to block people from crossing the Mediterranean? How are we going to block people from moving through the Mexico, US desert? No, they're prepared. They have anticipated that. Well, So we do need to have, of course, so for example, I've spent quite a bit of time in Lesbos. We need to think much better about how quickly we process people's applications, where they spend the time while they're being processed, what people do with that time, so it's not just traumatizing wasted time, how the local community participates and benefits from this. So it's not just outside humanitarians getting salaries and raising the rents, but actually local people whose industry, in the case of Lesbos, as kind of a tourist site, has collapsed because of migration, how there are other sources maybe of income. So we need to, I don't think there's a one size fits all. Lesbos is very different from Tijuana, but I think there are commonalities about how this becomes a new normal and what it means to be a welcoming place which people may be moving through or maybe staying in. So you need to have community security, which may well not be policing, other ways of having security. You need to think about having investments which local people benefit from in terms of shelter and housing and healthcare. So these are investments that states need to make. They shouldn't be making the investments, keeping people out, sending them back futilely to restart the journey and lose their lives. They should be investing in how you actually make this a kind of a win-win. So I think this is how I think we should be thinking about it. And I think this is why it's so disappointing to see UNHCR's work on impact really framed by cost instead of opportunity and a more creative way of thinking about reallocating resources. But I think the short answer to your question is yes, it means more investment in accepting that this is where action has to take place, not keeping people out and having the action in the middle of the desert or in the middle of the sea with very expensive infrastructure there, but having a different type of investment, which is more enabling and actually helps frontline communities. But I'll stop there. I see I'm already out of time.
Thank you so much, both Professor Baba and Professor Dahlström for her comments. We're going to take a short break, just 2 minutes, I think. So if you want to take a break, we'll come back in 2 minutes and start the second panel. So thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you, Nicholas, very much.
Great. Welcome back, everyone. We're now on to our second panel of this morning, and we have 3 presenters. I'll introduce them first. First off, we have Valentia Azarova, who is a visiting academic at Manchester International Law Center at University of Manchester. Amanda Brown is the founding editor-in-chief of the Promise Human Rights blog, and last year earned her JD from UCLA School of Law. And third, we have Itamar Mann, who teaches international law as part of the Faculty of Law at Haifa University. Their paper is titled Forced Disappearances from Authoritarianism to Border Violence. Our discussant for this second panel is Kaya Schilde, who is an associate professor here at Boston University's Parody School of Global Studies. I'll remind everyone of the format. It's 20 minutes for the discussant, 10 minutes response and comment, and then we'll have questions again. Remember, you can use your raised hand function, which is on the bottom panel. So with that, I'll now hand it over to Professor Schilde.
Thanks so much, Nick, for the introduction of the paper and the authors. And I don't have a PowerPoint, but I thought for my 20 minutes that first I would summarize the paper for everyone, for anyone who didn't get a chance to read it, and then pivot to some of the ways in which I think that the paper could be made even stronger and more important than it already is. So the paper itself, Forced Disappearances from Authoritarianism to Border Violence, it traces the development of contemporary international law on enforced disappearances from their origins in the domestic commissions and fora that emerged in 20th century authoritarian Latin America into the 21st century international law framework of having some kind of international informational and restorative remedies against the security and the secrecy around forced disappearances. The paper traces the concept of international legal justice for the people who have been disappeared by state agents or their families in particular, And this international legal justice happens when states participate or have knowledge in state terror, ethnic cleansing, or suppressing political opposition with violence. The paper then compares and contrasts individual disappearance under authoritarianism with modern border violence, including migration management practices such as unregistered and secret detention and summary expulsion, such as in particular the US's family separation policy at the US-Mexico border involving widespread enforced disappearance of children, and also cases of pushback and licit or illicit activities by EU states, in particular Croatia and Greece, and the EU itself at the southeastern borders of Europe. This is the big move of the paper, to put these things together, to compare these cases of migration management in Europe and the United States, and to compare it with the kind of individual violence or state-based individual violence against individuals of the 20th century in Latin America, and to subsume and reframe modern migration management practices as enforced disappearances. They make this logical and rhetorical link and say that making this logical and rhetorical link could provide established legal mechanisms, could extend these established legal mechanisms to the family members of disappeared migrants. This would not be preventive or justice-based, other than the important mechanism of having informational remedies that these existing legal frameworks provide to basically find out what happened to their relatives, which does not exist right now. So the logic of the paper it centers around the fact that currently missing migrants is a category without agency or without state agency right now. It's a crime without a perpetrator. It's something that happens without any kind of direct causal story of who made it happen. And that the creation of access to these remedies would only be possible through the proper illustration of the effects of state border control and migration management practices as enforced disappearances. And so they highlight that missing migrants essentially means that someone just drops off a map. That is the media narrative, that's the legal narrative right now, and that there isn't an established legal framework. And if you then, if they are successful, and hopefully we'll make them successful in making this term enforced disappearance apply to the context of border violence, then practices such as pushback operations can put the blame on the state, essentially, or the states who are engaging in these practices. And so there are a number of logical aspects to whether or not the authors will be successful in making this claim. And they do a wonderful job in tracing the logic and the comparative empirical aspects of this. But my comments are going to be trying to make this claim even stronger. And so I was taken with this paper in terms of I buy the logic that these four logical aspects legally, international law of what enforced disappearance are fit the category of border control violence and missing migrants. I also fully embrace the idea that it's necessary to make this move normatively in order to provide a category of people with rights that are currently unavailable. The convention that the authors are tying this to is the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, the ICPPED, that could possibly afford full protection to that actually was created to afford full protection to a broader universe of victims. So in some ways, in kind of casual language, I took the authors as saying that this is actually low-hanging fruit, that it doesn't require that much rhetorical or legal work on our part to make this connection, because the convention that they'd like to subsume border violence into was already created to afford full protection to an even broader category of victims than the cases that were in front of than the cases that drove the creation of the convention in the first place. And so this claim that the authors make, which they are successful at doing so, is that the crime of enforced disappearance under the Rome Statute requires intent, The perpetrator has to have, in this case states, has to have had the double intent of removing a person from the protection of the law and of doing so for a prolonged period of time. And so this could be even larger, considered a crime against humanity if it rises to a systematic or widespread attack on a civilian population. So I personally bought the argument, but I want to make sure, I want to see how we can scaffold it even better so that the normative turn the authors are seeking here can come to be. So in the paper, I learned so many things about the origins of the right to be free from forced disappearances. The part of the story I know well, the cases, especially in Europe, of modern migration management were not new to me. But the part where I learned so much, and I thought the authors did a wonderful job, was comparing and tracing this early development of international law and rights for disappeared persons as a larger category, such as these informal organizations, such as the Working Group on Enforced Disappearances, and then more formal inter-American conventions on enforced disappearances, and then eventually in the 2000s, the International Convention. That was a story I did not know well, but it's one I'm going to push the authors to better illustrate. One second, sorry. I'm sorry, I literally have children at home and they've screamed out to me now. I apologize.
We all know how that feels. So
it's not as cute as BBC Dad when it happens in all forms. It's not as funny either.
Yeah, that's what my wife keeps saying as well.
Yeah, I mean, if it were, we could make it something that makes everyone happy and spreads joy, but not all these do. So one moment, sorry.
I'll take this moment to tell everyone that the comments, that the chat is open for questions in case anyone has any. There's some people who had problems raising their hands here.
I'm going to have to help for 30 seconds. I'm so sorry.
Perhaps we can ask the panel to, shall we just wait 30 seconds? Yeah, we'll wait there.
I can jump in because I kind of totally saw the connections between this paper and a paper. I was just saying, I see connections between this paper and what Kaya and I were trying to say about regime type. And I think what's so interesting about your paper is exactly what she said. There's, even for those of us who've been thinking about how authoritarian these practices are, the value of being able to tie this over time and space is just incredible. Okay, you're back.
Oh, well, this was our shared humanity right now. So, okay, I was increasingly distracted by that over the last few minutes, and so it seems to be resolved. I'm sorry. So, let me get my head back into it for 3 seconds. Okay, so the argument is fantastic, but I was personally intrigued by this origin story of the enforced disappearance regime internationally, and the fact that it was driven by this Latin American experience of authoritarian violence in Latin American governments, especially in Argentina and Guatemala. And what I thought was fascinating was that this origin story started because of violence inside states, by states, domestically, rather than more external and visible international violence, such as border disappearances. And so I thought it's so interesting that the case was made by primarily domestic violence. The international law was built around that, and that these authors in the 21st century and in the year 2021 are making the effort to tie what is international violence at borders to this. And so I just thought that was interesting, first of all, but it's more than that. I actually think this is my first comment. I think it's fascinating that this origin story emerged the way it did. But I think it actually needs to be more precisely stylized to make certain concepts in the story more salient, and that'll eventually help the logic of the paper. So as a social scientist, I immediately thought of the puzzle, like why did the Latin American experience of forced disappearance prove to be this critical juncture in international law? The authors talk about how forced disappearances were earlier than that, the Soviet Union or other authoritarian regimes, or even especially as a colonial practice internationally. And so forced disappearance was both even more international historically and potentially even more widespread. So why Latin America in the 1970s and 1980s? Now, I'm not asking the authors to turn this into a social science paper, but I do think that the story of why this regime came about in the first place could actually help illuminate how the regime could be modified and translated into various contexts. Specifically because I think it'll help us understand what the barriers to and opportunities to adopting these kinds of regimes could be. Because the elephant in the room is that European states and the US are powerful states who don't allow a lot of violations of sovereignty in their human rights activities, or don't hear it or fight back against it. And so the authors are up against a huge barrier here in terms of realizing this. And so I think understanding the history, the successful history of the creation of this regime internationally in the first place, would help me understand how normatively it could be possible to apply it to the US and to Europe in the contemporary context. And so I don't ask you to test the causal story, but I want to have like a light causal story here about what prompted this origin in international law. Is it because, and I outlined a couple of brainstorming ideas, was it because authoritarian violence did become more internationalized through colonial or superpower involvement, such as US CIA involvement? Or was it actually a moment when there was less colonial or superpower involvement? Was it a moment of increased attention and agenda setting, or some kind of success of a social movement? Was it because of the shift in perpetrator type from the 1970s, which was mostly state actors, to the 1990s, which was non-state actors and paramilitaries? Was it simply the eventual success of decades of advocacy and hard work by lawyers' collectives? Was it because of the particularly egregious targeting of children as a victim? Or the authors mentioned once that potentially it might be because of the overlap of children as victims and the clandestine transportation of children across international borders? Was it simply an end of the Cold War story about an increasing ability to intervene in the domestic sovereign affairs of other states without provoking superpower intelligence cooperation? And there's a timeline here. This all starts in 1992 for the UN. The OAS codifies the Inter-American Convention in 1994. The European Court of Human Rights is 1990s on, and the actual International Convention itself was codified in 2006. So there's a timeline here that I'm not trying to push you to be more social scientists telling the causal why, but I think that understanding more, was it because it was children? Or was it because it was more international? Or was it because there was an opportunity in international power relations or in diplomacy that could really illuminate some of the agenda for the 21st century of how a modification of this convention or a different application of this convention could be possible in the realm of possible? It would actually help with the application. And then I had two more, I have 3 more minutes. So I have 2 more comments that I'm going to conflate into one. And that is that the paper makes an excellent and nuanced argument that migrant disappearances do fit this legal definition of rights under the convention. And there are 4 aspects to it. It involves arrest, detention, and abduction, the involvement of states or political organizations, a refusal or to acknowledge or denial or a concealment on the part of the state, and then the removing the person from the protection of law, usually physically or geographically, or through death. And so I think that this works. I bought it, But I actually think that the argument could be strengthened by scaffolding these aspects according to like some kind of necessary and sufficient aspect, or finding issues of more commonality and less commonality, because there are where things become less common is in the role of intentionality and denial of states. And so I can give more written comments about that, but I think that that's where the authors are going to have friction in this, is on the role of state awareness in enforced disappearance and state denial. Because in the 21st century, states like the US or European states can anticipate or exploit this lack of awareness for evading accountability. Intentionality is not just in the act of disappearing migrants, individual migrants, but it's also can be in the institutional design of bureaucracies or institutions with the authority over migration management, or a lack of needed reforms in the authority or capacity of these organizations. If states are aware that something about the capacity or the interagency process is creating opacity, maybe they fail to reform it, and that is intentionality. Also, I'm working on a book project right now about the outsourcing of migration management to third parties or the private sector. Outsourcing something for the sake of opacity is also intentionality, but that's where things get frictiony here. So if bureaucratic capacity, authority gaps, or something about governmental process produces opportunities for governance to make enforced disappearance of migrants more opaque, I think that structurally, that is also intentionality, but that's where things get difficult. And that comes right back to the cases of US border security and European border security, because both of those cases feature bureaucratic disarray and or authority black holes. In the United States, the family separation policy was intentional, but it also featured a lot of intergovernmental opacity or lack of intergovernmental process with different jurisdictional issues between different bureaucracies that can be exploited to actually produce human rights, poor human rights outcomes. In the EU case, Frontex itself is a black hole of authority. It was not designed in some conspiratorial way for opacity and accountability reasons, but it's quite useful to European states to refer accountability issues upwards to Frontex, and for Frontex to refer them right back down to European states, and for that to go around and around. And so that is the challenge for the authors, to think about this structural kind of lack of action, whether it's a imperfect institutional design or a lack of reform that allows these accountability issues to proceed. All right, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Now we'll turn to the authors, and they can respond for another 10 minutes. I'll let you decide how to respond.
Thank you so much, and thanks especially to the organizers, to Tali, to Professor Schild for this really illuminating and I think profound response. And also, I want to acknowledge that when we prepared this, Tali also sent me a report that was made by the clinic at BU and by Professor Akram, who is here, and is also about forced disappearances in the context of migration, which was really quite something to see that the thinking is happening in two different contexts at the same time along very, very similar lines. So I just want to acknowledge that. I'll just speak very briefly and then leave the floor for Valentina and Amanda. And I will address the general framework of the paper in the short intervention, and then I'll talk a little bit about the questions and critiques that we have that have been put forth. So in her comments, Professor Schild, am I pronouncing this correctly? Sorry.
It's Schilde, but yes, it's almost really perfect.
Thank you. Schilde, Professor Schilde concludes with the notion of black holes. And indeed, this paper is to some extent a continuation of ongoing research and advocacy concerning accountability towards the grave violations of migrant rights that emerged from this understanding. And you talk about Frontex in your remarks, and indeed, That's a great example, but also certain aspects of accountability for maritime migration, and perhaps a few other kind of legal mechanisms that create people that are in fact, as a strict legal matter, rightless in their condition. If we talk about rights as necessitating an enforcement and a possibility of enforcement and a kind of corresponding duty. So from this realization came the idea that people who don't have rights might still have opportunities indirectly through others that can exercise their rights in order to impose duties on states. And when we encountered the case of Fadi, who is a Syrian guy who was disappeared in the Evros region in Greece, and we're representing him together, we realized that families have these rights that can be exercised in the enforced disappearance framework, and thus overcome, at least in a very partial way, this condition of structured rightlessness that exists in some aspects of migration control today as a matter of law. So this is really a way to try to kind of overcome that difficulty, and not necessarily overcome it through the criminal angle alone. Of course, forced disappearances are a crime, and you emphasize in your comments the aspect of intent, but we try to show through this history also that they're much wider than just a criminal issue. They're a systemic remedy against forms of clandestine operations, against a kind of systematic lack of accountability that has to do with opacity and lack of information, which is what is granted to the families and enforceable through this indirect avenue. And in that regard, we are trying to work, as it were, in a reversed way. We're not asking why did the framework emerge, but we're trying to highlight those aspects of the existing framework that seem to echo certain aspects of what the framework, the enforced disappearance framework, ultimately put at the center of this political and kind of legal imagination, which is an aspect of truth, an aspect of information, and this unit as a basic category of the family at its center. And so I think it makes sense to kind of look at it from the opposite, and from kind of perhaps in a way that would make more sense historically and as a social science matter, as you say. But from our perspective, we were looking at kind of from a presentist angle, because we're also trying to develop remedies as lawyers for a client and for other clients potentially as well. Now, I'm just going to say one last thing, which is that I think at the center of your concern is also, and you say this, a political concern in terms of how acceptable this is within United Statesian as well as European audiences. And I think here we have a discussion between us that is still very much ongoing in terms of how narrowly or broadly we want to interpret these instruments. And I think that part of the discussion is not only a matter of interpretation, legal interpretation, but also a matter of strategy. And it is clear, I think, that perhaps we can narrow down a little bit the interpretation that we have currently in the paper, and then perhaps we get some more acceptability by certain audiences that are concerned by rule of law and administrative law and issues around those lines. But that's not entirely settled as far as we're concerned, and I think your comments really will help us a lot in carrying that discussion forward. I'd like to stop here, and perhaps either Valentina or Amanda want to chime in.
Sure, very, very briefly. Many thanks, Professor Schilde and Tali and others for the organizing, for the invitation again. Realize we're sort of running over time towards the discussion, so I'll just very briefly say that the way I very much agree that we need to do further work about on the origin story and the salient elements there, because there's something very interesting that we did understand in the limited work so far with primary documents, but nonetheless the interesting secondary sources we've reviewed on the development of this framework in international human rights law, and in particular the right not to be subject to an enforced disappearance, which essentially was very much developed on the back of the protagonists who were the families and the struggles that they led for decades in the Latin American context to expose primarily what was going on, who was responsible, and how and where power what power relations led to the operation of these policies for so many years without actually being known or understood as state policies, right? They were very covert and had thousands and thousands of victims before the moments, the political moments emerged where transitional justice processes, truth and reconciliation processes were possible, right? But those were, let's say, classical repressive regimes in the sense that, well, the international system or even the regional system at the time was not very influential, was not able really or took many years to affect some level of change. But again, the families, the advocacy, the movements around them and the perseverance which led to the development of these frameworks, somehow now we're only seeing sort of more recently the dividends in terms of accountability. But the human rights framework really breaks down that repressive systematic policy nature of the practice into very specific pieces and walks it back so as to essentially create a preventive regime, in the sense that it creates a right not to be subject to secret detention. It provides very detailed provisions on how detention should be managed in terms of recognized spaces, registration information, et cetera, right? Including the criminalization of enforced disappearance as a composite complex right. But the political repressive and intentional dimension of that practice was, in a sense, taken, it's there in criminal law, of course, because that's where intentionality and duration matter and the widespread impact matters. But in human rights law, the emphasis was very much on the individual experience and deprivation that results, that is the resultant effect of certain types of essentially illegal detention. So in a very simple sense, in a positivist legal doctrine sense, these are just very special forms of secret illegal detention that necessarily go up to, in the system sense, the political echelons, because they are endorsed, because they are, if not explicitly, as in the case of Greece, denied at the highest echelons by the judiciary, by, of course, relevant law enforcement authorities, they will not be subject to accountability in practice. There's a culture of impunity. There's a denial of access to justice in practice at a systematic level around these practices. So the other aspect of the remedial model, which perhaps we can come back to in the discussion, that I think is really important to emphasize, is that it really goes beyond the family as well. It actually the category of concerned persons in the convention extends to society. And in that sense, society, in essence, Greek society, Croatian, or the US have a claim to make in relation to that practice as a practice that represents a certain breakdown of the rule of law, a certain breakdown of criminal procedure, and a certain also, of course, persecution or repression of a political group in effect, or social group in effect. And that threat from within or without, I think that's an interesting, indeed, discussion we can perhaps continue to have, or indeed should elaborate on in the paper.
Great, thank you. Amanda, I want to let you speak, but we also want to get to questions. So I'll give it to you for a few minutes and then we'll open it to questions.
Sure, I'll be very brief then. But first, just to echo, thank you so much, Professor Schilde, for your comments, and to everybody for hosting us. In my brief moment before we open it up, I just want to emphasize that a tool of what the international human rights law framework offers us here, the international criminal law doesn't, is this intentionality aspect that that we've been briefly talking about already, which is extremely important, I think. And Professor Schilde, you highlighted that intentionality isn't just in the act of disappearing individual migrants, but also in institutional design of bureaucracy. And I think that even though it is necessary to prove intention in the international human rights law framework, that I think that these acts of omission or this creation of opacity that you mentioned is so important and is seen in the family separation context for sure. And Alonso Garmendi speaks to this in his analysis of the family separation policy, saying that enforced disappearance can actually also happen by negligence. And so even if a government isn't intending for people to become disappeared in the system, the fact that they can't just say, well, we didn't know about it, that does not exempt them from accountability or from liability. Because if people are falling through the cracks in the system that they create, then that's enough of an issue into itself. I do see that it's 10:35, so that's just the one short comment that I'll make, and then we can open it up for questions.
Great, thank you so much. We have our first hand raised. Professor Baba, would you like to start us off?
Thank you. Thank you for a terrific paper. I really enjoyed it. And also thank you for excellent comments. I just want to make a simple observation, which I think is pertinent to both, which is that what's so powerful about the concept of enforced disappearance is how the passive becomes active. How it, disappearance sounds like something that just happens, but what the paper does, and I think this is also what the comments just brought out, is this act of making somebody disappear or creating. This is a state strategy which has to be a legal target, and that's what I think is so good about the way you formulate the paper. This the kind of active responsibility of the state in enabling disappearance, and as was just pointed out, Amanda, you just said this. Whether it is actively disappearing through commission or omission, it doesn't really change the kind of moral and legal weight of it, which is a dramatic set of human rights violations. So I think that's what's so powerful, because of course so much of the government narrative is precisely to kind of abstain from taking responsibility and kind of merely naturalizing the phenomenon that, of course, people, it's the traffickers, it's the smugglers who put people's lives at risk, and we are simply trying to protect them. So I think turning the tables and linking the point about, in creating dangerous journeys and then creating dangerous, obscure landing spots which are out of the gaze of which are hard to monitor, is exactly the point. So it is this deliberate creation of a dangerous site where the state is relatively unsupervised, which I think is so important. So just to say this, I love this transition between the passive and the active voice, and I think this is a really useful way of seeing exactly what's happening, and you could trace it way beyond disappearances to what's happening in Libya and what's happening in Niger. I mean, this whole externalization process is a process of kind of actively removing a kind of penetrating gaze further and further away.
Thank you so much. I want to remind everyone to use the raised hand function, or you can put in the chat feature your questions. Also, there are many students in the audience, and I highly recommend asking your questions. This is open for everyone, not just faculty. And the more questions, the better, because this is feedback for the working drafts. Great. So I'm going to start with Dana. I'm going to butcher your last name. If you'd like to start.
Hi, thank you so much for coming today and speaking about your paper. I also really enjoyed it. I was wondering about the international context with the than the domestic law context, because there was a point in the paper when you talked about how only some states have adopted domestic laws to address this, to address forced disappearances. And I'm wondering if you see that as something that is a really strong barrier towards having some sort of accountability for this, if you think that it must come from domestic law, and so that means that there has to be some sort of buy-in from nation states, or if it's something that can be held accountable through international law, and how you see that playing out.
Shall we get another question from Kaya, and then we can have the panel respond?
Yeah, thank you. I know I'm coming in after being the discussant, but this conversation is so fascinating because I think actually that the authors, since they're engaging this, should actually get ahead of this in front of the issue of intentionality and by omission, and maybe create categories, or rankings of different kinds of intentionality. Perhaps there is the intentionality by omission just of having low bureaucratic capacity, right? But then, if there's any empirical evidence that this has been brought to the attention of a bureaucrat or an official, then it shifts into a different category where it's still poor bureaucratic capacity, but somebody in a position of leadership has had some level of awareness about that. So this is what the kind of thing I was thinking about, just in terms of actual practice and analytical categories.
Great, thank you. I'll let the panel respond for a bit.
I just need to say that I was dropped off the call for a moment because of the connectivity reasons, and I didn't hear the first question, but maybe others want to answer, and then I can chime in on.
Amanda, why don't you go ahead, since I took so much time in the...
No problem. Well, I'll summarize my understanding of the first question also, so that Itamar is up to speed on that. Basically, Dana was asking, do we see the required buy-in from states as a strong barrier towards some sort of accountability? Like, must that accountability come from some domestic law, or can it be held accountable through international law? And Itamar, I imagine you might want to chime in here, but our understanding is that there can be accountability held through international law here, especially because the prohibition of enforced disappearance has risen to the level of customary international law. So even if you have a state like the United States, which hasn't signed on to the convention, there still are avenues through which accountability can be sought, including through perhaps other state parties that are involved in or perhaps even just complacent with enforced disappearance. So for instance, in the US-Mexico context, looking at routes of accountability through Mexico, we're also looking at the opportunity to seek accountability through, if a nation state is a state party to the convention and one of their nationals has been a victim of enforced disappearance, looking at the role of accountability that state has to play for their own nationals, even if they are not the person, if they're not the state that disappeared them themselves. I'll let Itamar and Valentina join in here too.
Yeah, okay, Valentina, go ahead.
I was just going to mention also, I mean, that the working group is relevant, of course, because it essentially monitors the declaration, which is customary, which also has the status of jus cogens, apparently, according to some authors. So we've yet to mine that literature. But indeed, the relationship between the international and domestic, the idea that now all state parties to the convention have to criminalize explicitly that particular violation of human rights as a crime, which then also in particular iterations of it needs to be understood as a crime against humanity, which of course many states will also have to criminalize under Rome Statute obligations, is only secondary to a reality in which states practice enforced disappearance without actually either well, certainly not accepting that practice is being used. The perfect example for that is Greece. Greece is actually currently under review by the Committee on enforced disappearances, and it's its first cycle of review. So it's actually presenting its domestic legislation and implementation of the conventions that are substantive dimensions. And in the only submission, I think it was Human Rights Watch's submission, is the only NGO submission, although there was one other, pointing to the border violence practices that should be labeled as such, right? Neither the committee in its list of issues, nor Greece, of course, or even the Greek Ombuds Office submission points to any practices currently in place that may amount to enforced disappearance. So there is a significant gap there in both the labeling by international institutions, but even if the domestic legislation is there in place, of bringing cases before domestic authorities with that label, which would necessarily require a different response than such similar cases being brought before Greek courts and prosecutors quite regularly on the illegal expulsion. Itamar.
So I think one fantasy should obviously, and I think this is not controversial, be immediately eliminated, which is that there could be accountability without power, without state power, or without a measure of power involved, and that international law will simply, transcend political power. That's not going to be the case. Rather, in terms of an advocacy strategy, this is a kind of transnational advocacy strategy. So the attempt is to find the levers, the opportunities, the cracks where this argument might kind of stick, and to utilize them and to kind of grab those opportunities in order to to expand them further down the line. And so, for example, this Article 15 that Valentina has mentioned in a brief conversation we had before this meeting generates obligations to states where victims of disappearances reside or are located to help them with remedies with respect to other states. So there is a way in which that can be channeled into a kind of transnational legal advocacy strategy. Now, with regard to Professor Schilde's last remarks, which I was able to hear in the original, I think that the acknowledgement point that you make and the continuum of intent that you suggest are really fruitful ways to think about this. And I think that the category becomes more resonant in cases where indeed there was a kind of attempt to be granted information. There was a subjective experience by a victim that came forward and said, wait, where's my brother? Where's my wife? Where's my mom? And they were not granted an answer. As a matter of strategy and as a matter of advocacy, those are the central cases that will resonate, I think, with this legal framework. Now, that doesn't mean that as a matter of law that is necessarily required, but it could very well be that it's not only a strictly legal interpretation that is a question here, but also the identification of a social group that in reality is already making such claims on their own behalf, whether they acknowledge the Latin American roots of this or not. And in fact, since we started to work on this and after we sent this paper, we discovered that there are, for example, in Italy, a number of Argentinian expats that are activists within migrant communities that are saying exactly the same things and making this particular connection that we try to make in this text from the bottom up. I think identifying those people and trying to echo and support their campaigns is what may perhaps give this some measure of traction.
Great, thank you. We have a few more questions and about 8 more minutes. So if Audrey Macklin, would you like to ask the first question?
Thanks. This was a wonderful paper and presentation, and I think it is extraordinarily generative, both practically and theoretically, and I'm delighted to learn more about this. My question is about whether there is a connection to be made between the forced disappearance and the foundation. Let me see if I can try this. The extent to which migrants are discursively disappeared from the framework of international human rights. That is to say, when you start in the Latin American context, you start with people who are recognized as legal subjects within that domain. And so they are, in that sense, legally visible, and they are physically disappeared as a way of also making them disappear as kind of legal subjects. In addition to the intentionality challenge here, I'm wondering if you are also thinking about this, the disappearance of migrants as legal subjects, as legal subjects through the very act of migration. And that's exposed both in the willingness or unwillingness of states of nationality to step up in respect of them, but also in their kind of the extent to which, as a matter of their territorial presence or non-presence, their legal status or non-status, they're also in some sense disappeared from the legal order as such. I'm sorry, that was a bit of a wandering question, but I hope that there was some thread in it that can be followed.
Thank you. I'm going to gather a few more questions and then we can wrap up with your response. Professor Susan Ekram, would you like to proceed?
Yes, hi, thank you so much. And I'm sorry not to have read the paper yet, but I'm really looking forward to it and appreciate the comments around the sort of the legal framework. And I have so many responses, but I'll just confine myself to a couple. One is the point about intentionality. And I think that it's been quite clear, at least in the American context, since the 1980s, since the seminal case of Velázquez Rodriguez, that intentionality is not required for a finding of enforced disappearance, that it is sufficient to show direct or indirect consent or acquiescence of the state, and acquiescence being the really important operative word here. So that's really one critical point to kind of engage with. The other is that I think that the families of the disappeared, at least in the Americas, are way ahead of the theorists. In our work on the migrant disappearances report, we spent the last 5 years meeting with family collectives all across the Northern Triangle, and they have been so active. There is no question that this issue is being buried. It is very much at the top of the agenda. And because of the work of the family collectives, for the first time, Mexico passed its Ley de Víctimas and an external mechanism to allow families all across the Americas to file their claims through Mexican consulates. And very much acknowledging that the right to truth, the right to an investigation, the right to responses, the right to respectful returns of remains and burials, to allow burials so that ashes are not returned when families want the remains. I think the families are just way ahead of all of us, and that it's really important to listen to them because they made this law happen, and now they're in the process of making sure that the law gets implemented. And we've been really lucky to be able to work with them for these last 5, now going on 6 years. So just in terms of turning back to where it's really important, which is the families themselves.
Thank you. We have another question from Professor Daniela Caruso.
Hi, thank you for this. It's really powerful. Now I'm working far away from my usual field of work, but I feel geographically close by way of birth to a lot that has been discussed and hinted at in this paper. I just wanted to, in order to create legal frameworks, I really love the idea of trying and reach for whatever existing legal instrument or framing that is useful to tackle the problem of forced disappearances, wherever such frames can be found. I would add the El Masri case to the picture. That seems to me one in which the European Court of Human Rights made a statement that is well known around the world that tackles disappearance. It does it through the lens of torture, and so the facts may not be as egregious on that front, but the core of the legal argument is the disappearance itself, and that goes to intentionality. Macedonia was found to be culpable, not because of intention, but because it enabled others to engage in the disappearance. So I would somehow encourage the authors to fold it into their search for existing legal frameworks.
Thank you. We have a few minutes for just last remarks by the panel.
Okay, I'll just briefly address Audrey Macklin's points first, to say that I think the points that you have made are extraordinarily fruitful in the following sense. I think that there is a legal theoretical story to be told around disappearance that also relates to this idea of appearance as a kind of constitutive category of the political community. This is a story that I believe political theorist Ayten Gündüz is trying to advance in recent writing and has been talking about. And on the other hand, there's a legal story. The legal story is much more closely committed to the interpretation of the existing instruments. And so there is a connection between these stories, but they also need to be somehow held apart. And to try to bridge that is also one of the things that this paper tries to do. We don't want to fall into an argument that is essentially metaphoric or only theoretical, but we do want to use that kind of political theory background in order to illuminate and make the legal analysis more informative. With regard to Susan Akram's points, I just want to really embrace them and say that we have learned a lot from the very few points that you have made here today, and that I really look forward to going deeper into your report and perhaps talking with you directly in order to further this project. It sounds like you know a lot of things that are fundamental. And with regard to Daniela Caruso's suggestion of the Masri case, I just want to put on the table that the whole renditions project that has been really central to post 9/11 advocacy around counterterrorism is in a way very related to this category of disappearances. So I think that not only El Masri, but a number of other European Court of Human Rights cases are relevant. The whole discussion of black sites could be made relevant. And in that regard, there is a parallel with the post 9/11 discussion. It really is a question how deep one wants to go into this, but I could see a version of this project that really covers that as well. Think merely about the fact that Guantanamo was, of course, a migrant detention center before it became a counterterrorism facility of some kind. This happened in other places in the world, this kind of overlap. Okay, I'm done. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Valentia, did you want to add?
Nothing, just thank you. Thank you very much for all the comments. And Susan Akram, very much looking forward to speaking more.
Thank you again to the panelists and to our discussant, Kaya Shilda. We're going to be back at 11 o'clock, so in 4 minutes. So we'll see you soon for the third panel for today. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Our third panel today, we have Sabrina Ardalan, who is clinical professor of law and director of the Harvard Immigration and Refugee Clinical Program. Her paper is titled Challenging Stereotypes in Refugee Protection. Our discussant is Rachel Rosenblum, who is Associate Dean for Experiential Education at Northeastern University School of Law. And we know the format, 20-minute discussant comments and 10-minute response, followed by questions, and I really encourage all students to please participate and add comments. I'll hand it over now to Dean Rosenblum.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here today. Thank you to all of the organizers of this event. I'm an immigration scholar. I'm not primarily an international law scholar, so I'm learning a lot, and I found that the two papers so far fascinating, and it's been really interesting to read Professor Ardalan's paper and to think about the issues that she raises. So this paper is called Challenging Stereotypes in Refugee Protection. And Professor Ardalan is a clinical professor of law at Harvard Law School and director of the Harvard Immigration and Refugee Clinic. She has extensive experience representing asylum seekers and has written a number of insightful articles about refugee law. So I know I often look to her personally and to her scholarship for guidance. So it was a real treat to read this paper. In this piece, Professor Ardalan takes on, as she puts it, a tension inherent in refugee law: how to win protection for individual clients without reinforcing victim narratives and negative stereotypes about other cultures and countries. And she focuses a lot on gender asylum, which is an area that she's worked in a lot. And it's an area where these issues are often salient. For example, a domestic violence claim might be contextualized with evidence about a culture of machismo, for example, in a particular country. So she suggests two solutions to the problem of over-reliance on stereotypes. They both revolve around evidence. The first proposed solution is to reconsider the corroboration demands imposed on refugees. And this is, I should say, this is all centered on the US adjudication system, right? So the immigration courts and the asylum system. So to reconsider the corroboration demands imposed on refugees and to afford asylum seekers the benefit of the doubt. That is to accept that they could meet their burden of proof simply through their own testimony, which really lies at the root of where refugee law came from, but has been complicated over the years. And her second proposed solution is to provide asylum seekers with meaningful access to holistic representation, and thus access to the kinds of country conditions evidence that is in our current system necessary to corroborate asylum claims. Professor Ardalan has a deep grounding both in this area of practice and in this body of scholarship, and she does a beautiful job of combining these two elements. And she's also taking on, I think, in this paper, a really core issue that everyone who practices in this area and writes about this area of law has to contend with, which is kind of the oversimplification, the tendency to kind of embrace a certain well-worn narrative, which sometimes obscures some of the complexity of the cases that we deal with. So I'm going to focus my comments on two frameworks that shape this analysis. One centers on stereotypes and narrative, and the other on evidentiary issues and their relationship to structural inequities in adjudication. I'm going to start with the theme of evidence and how it relates to structural inequities within adjudication. Professor Ardalan interrogates the relationship between two key types of evidence at issue in any asylum claim. So first, there is an asylum applicant's own testimony that's at the core of any claim. And then the second category is this category of evidence of country conditions. And that's where Professor Ardalan identifies a real risk of reliance on stereotypes and generalizations as opposed to careful, nuanced observations grounded in empirical research. She poses a set of questions about the relationship between these two types of evidence. I think one of her key insights is that there's a value system embedded in our adjudication structures, and it revolves around evidence and expertise. So one way to think about this is that asylum applicants are experts in their own experience. They are the best situated to explain it, right, to testify about it. But as Professor Ardalan notes, that expertise is systematically devalued in this system and almost always has to be corroborated by outside sources, namely country conditions evidence. But country conditions evidence, as she argues, is deeply problematic in a number of ways. First, asylum seekers don't necessarily have access to it. It's one of the huge gaps between represented and unrepresented asylum seekers. Second, the human rights reports that are produced by the State Department every year carry enormous weight in this system, and particularly in the cases of unrepresented clients. And those reports are often deeply flawed. So she notes, for example, that there was a shift in State Department country reports redressing gender-based violence under the Trump administration. She gives the example of a country report on El Salvador. Right? So these reports come out every year, and in 2016, it included, the country report on El Salvador included 12 paragraphs of information on domestic violence and rape in El Salvador, including specific statistics about numbers of cases. 2017, in the Trump administration, the report suddenly contained only 3 very general paragraphs about laws criminalizing rape and domestic violence, right? That's going to undercut an asylum claim, and about investigation of incidents involving police. So these changes, she argued, can have profound implications for asylum seekers, especially those who are unrepresented. And then thirdly, she notes, attorneys sometimes get lazy and resort to country conditions information that relies on stereotypes rather than careful analysis. So she suggests several potential reforms to address these problems. She wants the system to value an applicant's own evidence more, a return to the roots of refugee law. She wants all applicants to have access to representation so that, among other things, they can have access to country conditions information. And she wants attorneys to be more careful about what evidence they use. In my opinion, country conditions information is an under-theorized area of refugee law. It hasn't attracted as much attention as some other areas. And so I'm very glad to see Professor Ardalan taking on this particular topic. And her discussion of these issues raised in my mind a set of questions about the broader ways in which the production of knowledge about country conditions is an inherently contested site. And I'm thinking back here to my own experience in the 1990s working at an organization that engaged in gathering country conditions information. It was at the time the only organization in the US, and pretty much the only organization anywhere in the world, that was systematically tracking LGBTQ human rights issues. It was then called the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission. It's now called Outright International. It wasn't particularly focused on asylum to begin with, but it happened to be founded the same year that the first LGBTQ asylum case was granted by an immigration judge. And so it quickly became a place that, that attorneys would turn to try to get documentation for cases. And so it was very interesting to sort of see, there were these dynamics at play in the construction of that body of data. One thing that the organization did was to pressure the Department of State to include these LGBTQ issues in the Department of State country reports. And Professor Ardalan notes the same thing was done in terms of gender-based violence. And as she also notes, it's kind of an ongoing, it's not a one-shot deal, it's an ongoing struggle to maintain coverage of those issues. But, you know, so that was one part of it. But there was also these other kind of complex dynamics. So another thing that the organization did was to pressure, and I'd say sometimes kind of try to publicly shame some of the big mainstream human rights organizations like Amnesty into including LGBTQ issues. At that point, none of them did. There was simply literally no coverage of these issues in this body of documentation of human rights abuses. But it was so complicated. So the information at issue, you know, someone had been killed or beaten, or there would have been a raid, or, you know, something had happened, right? The information virtually always originated with a grassroots gay rights organization in a particular country. And that information on its own was not going to be highly valued in an asylum claim. Those organizations were considered partisan and activist, and they didn't have professional credentials. And so it was of limited use, right? And so we would then, and I have to say, the organization these days is very large and has attorneys working for it. At those days, I was not an attorney at that point. We had no attorneys on staff. It was kind of a ragtag little group of people, but we were based in the US. We had a board of directors that had academics and attorneys. And, you know, we had a little bit more respectability, but not much. I mean, things with our name, the kinds of publications we generated still weren't entirely respected in the system. And so we would funnel this information to groups like Amnesty, and they would take their time and kind of, you know, look into it, verify it, and then they would put it out under their own name. And it was fascinating because you know, the director of the organization would get kind of irked because they would never credit us, right? They would, in her view, they kind of stole our work in gathering this information. And I was young, I didn't know a lot about the legal system then. I hadn't gone to law school yet, but I remember it was kind of explained to me by someone that it was actually beneficial in the asylum context that our name wasn't on it, that it kind of got put through this system and came out the other side. And so I think there are these layers of complexity that can be seen in the interplay between social scientists, human rights lawyers, grassroots activists, journalists, and others who are engaged in this production of knowledge. And so I really welcome Professor Ardalan's insights into the ways that in particular stereotypes come into play in this realm. And so let me talk a little bit about the framework of stereotypes. So she situates her consideration of country conditions within the context of the role that stereotypes play in refugee law. And this question of stereotypes and narrative is, as I'm sure most of you know, is a really central issue for all of us who practice in this area or write about these issues. Rescue narratives are kind of baked into refugee law. And Professor Ardalan draws on a considerable body of work in this area by Susan Akram and many others. Her discussion of stereotypes provides us, I think, with a new and different way to think about the difference between represented and unrepresented asylum applicants, because it's actually generally attorneys who introduce these kinds of stereotypes and tropes into cases. And I think one sort of uncomfortable truth we might think about here is that may to some extent account for some of the higher success rates among represented clients, right? That attorneys know what kinds of claims and what kinds of applicants are more legible to this system than others. And it can sometimes be difficult to resist putting clients into those boxes. And I'm not talking, of course, about inventing claims, but about packaging claims in a way that is recognized. And I think the very nature of the particular social group definition, which is really of huge importance within gender asylum cases, encourages attorneys to do this, right? To fit clients into spaces that have been carved out by previous cases. So unlike other protected grounds like race, religion, political opinion, nationality, people who are claiming persecution on the basis of a particular social group have to establish that the group counts as a group. And so if it's been recognized previously, you can take advantage of that. So there's this tendency to kind of try to fit your clients into a recognized category. And these issues come up everywhere, right? Not just in country conditions. They come up in the drafting of affidavits. They come up in the legal theories of the case. These issues around race, gender, class, sexuality, religion. I think we're always kind of, those of us in this field are always negotiating the tensions between strategies that are going to be effective for winning a case and the strategies, then the theories that feel, narratives that feel genuine and sometimes often are more complex. And, Susan Akram's article about the persistence of Orientalism within refugee law is a perfect example of talking about those issues. So Professor Ardalan situates her discussion of stereotypes in country conditions information in this broader context. And as I said before, I don't think country conditions information has received the attention it deserves. So I'm very glad to see that. I want to I want to talk for a couple minutes about, and this is my last point really, about an issue that I found really interesting and I would love to see developed further. It's kind of just mentioned in passing, but Professor Ardalan discusses agency case law on particular social group claims. And the original test for membership in a particular social group, which was set forth in the 1980s in matter of Acosta, was just immutability, right? So if you, to show something as a particular social group, you have to show that it's a characteristic that either can't be changed in a person or is so fundamental that it shouldn't have to be changed. And something that I hadn't, so the board, well, I should say, the board has added in the intervening years 2 additional factors: social distinction and particularity. How is that group seen within the society as a whole? And what are the kind of the boundaries of it? And something that, you know, I think we all hate these new factors and spend a lot of time thinking about them. They're very difficult to work around, particularly, for example, in domestic violence claims. But something that this piece really made me think differently about the change that has been wrought with adding those factors. I never really thought before about how much these new factors have altered the balance between these different forms of evidence. So immutability relies entirely on a person's own experience, right? I mean, it may be something that sort of objectively they can't change, but particularly if it's something that they are saying is fundamental and shouldn't have to be changed, a particular identity, their sexual orientation, whatever it may be, that's really about that person. And so it centers an applicant's own testimony. These additional factors, is a particular group socially distinct in the society in question? And is it defined with particularity? Rely entirely on country conditions. It just really takes the inquiry out of the realm of something that someone can explain entirely through personal experience. And that has huge implications for, I've thought about it, and there's lots of discussion about these factors and the kind of the barriers that they have set up for asylum seekers, but really thinking about them as evidentiary matters and the implications for people's access to that kind of information about a society versus their own experience, I found very, very interesting. And I would love to see more about that. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the final version of this paper and hearing from Professor Ardalan in her comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those really helpful comments, and thank you all for having me here with you today. I'm really grateful for this space and for a chance to think through some of these complicated questions around what can be done to rethink the asylum system and how the current interpretations of US asylum law contribute to the creation of this fortress North America, right? So I feel like this is sort of a method in which asylum law baked into it in the US has fortified our borders and exacerbates tendencies around who we're letting in and who we're not letting in because of the ways that stereotypes have infiltrated refugee law in the US. And so, as Professor Rosenblum noted, this piece really builds on a lot of extraordinarily thoughtful critiques that many people who are part of this workshop have put forward around asylum law and refugee law more broadly. Professors Akram and Baba and Professor Sinha and many others have weighed in this space. And so, I think the reason I thought it might be helpful to revisit that conversation in this current moment was because of this rule that was promulgated under President Trump that was finalized that would have eliminated the use of stereotype-based evidence in asylum proceedings. And that rule was enjoined because of lawsuits filed by many people across the country, including our clinic. And one of the challenges in thinking about that rule and what to do about it was, I think, a lot of tension in the advocacy community around whether or not to tackle that provision of the rule as one that needed to be undone or not. And so objectively on its face, eliminating evidence based on stereotypes might not seem problematic, but because of all of the reasons that Professor Rosenblum just explained, it ends up being problematic for lawyers who are presenting their cases, right? You know, I think Professor Rosenblum, your thoughts about sort of the difference between unrepresented people going through the asylum system and represented people and the role that stereotypes play in those two different sets of cases is really interesting and not something I think I had really thoroughly explored. So I really look forward to thinking through that issue a little more. I thought it might be helpful to provide a little context for why that provision, it's complicated, even though on its face it shouldn't be. And it's because, you know, I think one of the solutions I present is potentially finding evidence that's more empirical or more objective, statistics-based, you know, something to move away from these tropes that that are easy to fall into and hang your hat on when there might when that might be the most readily available information. But you know, I think as I've had conversations with people in this space about what this would mean, the reality on the ground is when you're scrambling to put together a filing for immigration court and you're sifting through country condition evidence that will best make your, you know, the case for the person that you're representing, you may not have the time to weed through the thousands of pages that are out there about gender-based asylum and gender-based violence in certain countries to figure out if the sort of side effect of submitting that evidence is in fact exacerbating these negative stereotypes about men coming from those countries, right? And so, you know, I think part of the problem are these narratives, right? Criminalizing people from countries around the world, you know, from Central America, construing everyone to be a gang member, Middle East, construing people to be terrorists, right? Whatever the stereotype is. And so, you know, in my work as an advocate in my clinical hat, right? I have to do everything I can to, as a zealous advocate, to make the strongest case possible for my client. And so that mean putting forward evidence that has implicit in it or explicit in it statements that vilify entire sections of the population who I may also be representing in another case, right? And so how to reconcile those tensions with the realities of what being an asylum lawyer means. And so, you know, I think theorizing about this is difficult in some ways when you're also trying to grapple with what it means on the ground in doing the work. And so I think that it would be really helpful to sort of hear folks' thoughts about that, because I do think, you know, some part of what I'm writing feels like it comes into tension with my ethical duties of zealous representation, right? And so how to reconcile those two things. And I think the way I was trying to reconcile those two things was by leaning into, you know, the benefit of the doubt principle and the importance of an applicant's testimony. And in really thinking about what the burden of proof is in asylum cases, right? So it's on the asylum applicant to prove that they're eligible for protection in the US, but under US and international law, an applicant need only show a reasonable possibility that they would suffer harm if returned to their home country. And so, you know, the US Supreme Court has explained that that could mean a 1 in 10 chance. And so, you know, is there a way to sort of make more of that, to really sort of have adjudicators embrace that in a way that I don't think is the reality often on the ground. So we can say a 1 in 10 chance, we can cite the Supreme Court precedent and still feel like actually we need to prove to almost a certainty, otherwise we won't win as advocates, right? But is there a way to sort of to figure out how to push back against these corroboration requirements that are increasingly being imposed, whether it's by figuring out ways to really argue what the standard of risk is more persuasively, or to really try to convince adjudicators that more credence should be lent to applicants' own testimonies, which is the standard under UNHCR and international law, and even to some extent in US case law has drawn on those principles. But even in conversations with adjudicators, when I've sort of presented that as a lens through which applicants' testimonies should be considered, there's some, pushback around that, right? And an assumption that applicants' claims should be treated with objectivity as opposed to giving either side the benefit of the doubt. And so how does one reconcile what is, I think, a fundamental principle of refugee law, this benefit of the doubt principle, with these questions around proof and credibility. And I think that the insistence under US law, especially for corroboration and sort of extreme amounts of corroboration, that I think the US is sort of, out of step with what international refugee law envisioned in terms of a process. And, as Professor Rosenblum indicated, many people aren't represented, right? And so what does that mean for them? And how does that shake out in those contexts? I think I would query whether stereotypes play less of a role in those cases or not, given that adjudicators may themselves be relying on the same sources of country condition evidence that reinforce these stereotypes, like State Department country reports and other things, even if the applicant themselves isn't presenting those very reports. And so, yes, I think you raised very interesting questions about whether as lawyers we exacerbate it, or whether it would still and does still happen even without the lawyering that introduces even more of this evidence. I think one other thing that I've been grappling with that it would be really helpful to hear folks' thoughts on is this question of, are there generalizations that aren't stereotypes? So is there a world in which evidence based on generalizations is okay, where, is there a line between a generalization and a stereotype? What is that line? And how do we think through what evidence is problematic versus not, and make the case most persuasively? I think, and how do we identify what kinds of empirical evidence? How do we identify empirical evidence that we can draw on? And when is that empirical evidence inherently more reliable or less sort of laden with stereotypes entrenched in, either the way that evidence is gathered or, what's missing from that evidence? And so I think that there are questions around sort of, as I think through problematic evidence, what is in fact good evidence, what's bad evidence, what would work to help push back against these stereotypes and still make the case most persuasively for asylum seekers, given that is at the end of the day the hat that I wear as a lawyer and as a scholar. I think I want to question that the techniques that I use and all of that, but at the same time, not undermine, zealous advocacy. So yeah, I look forward to hearing folks' thoughts.
Great, thank you so much for both the comments and the response. We can now open up to questions. Please use the raised hand function, or you can message it in the chats to us, and we can go from there. Any first questions? I think in the meantime, we can start with Daniela Caruso, if you'd like to start.
Sure. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Sabrina. This is quite fascinating. And I wanted to just zoom onto the issue of the ethical dilemma. How do I represent zealously my client without borrowing from stereotypes that in the end may end up hurting another client in a different group? And I think that's powerful, but then I don't think you can escape the dilemma. And I love the fact that you embrace it so honestly, but I think that the fact that you point out that this dilemma as a scholar can open up, as a scholar, you can say and think whatever you want. And I don't know if you want to push in this direction, but there is one generalization to answer your quest that is not a stereotype, right? So, and that would be a generalization that unfortunately is not admitted in the discourse of asylum, which is this, it's the economic, material, socio-economic conditions of the person where the person lives, right? So if you describe the country as, for whatever a historical reason, being a country that doesn't offer material resources, you're not stereotyping any group. You're targeting objective conditions. The problem is the frame. The problem is the frame of asylum law that doesn't allow you to focus on the economic, because you have to identify your person as a victim of some other kind of malaise that cannot be, you see where I'm going with this. I mean, I think that as a scholar, what you're pointing at is the stifling nature of the debate in which you're allowed to participate, and the built-in dilemma, which is structural to a system that in the end may just prove to be ill-conceived. I just wanted to bring this up.
Great, would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you. I very much appreciate that sort of zooming out of, right. I am very much trying to operate within a framework that has many, there are many things I would critique about it. But I think in this project, I was really just trying to think through, if I'm stuck with this framework, which I am with my lawyer hat, right? What can I do within it? But I think your point really highlights just the fundamental problem of the framework that I am trapped in with my lawyering hat, as opposed to with my scholarly hat. And so I think, at least providing some of that context will be helpful in exploring why in some ways the arguments that I'm putting forward are so constrained, right? Because they're assuming a need to operate within a very constraining framework.
Thank you. Tali, would you like to ask a question?
Sure. So thank you so much, Professor Ardalan and Professor Rosenblum. Just a few thoughts about how this connects to our bigger project on Fortress North America today. One thing that immediately comes to mind is that the process of creating this fortress is a process that, we talked about in my introduction. I mentioned, media and military and border control and so on, but it's also those, benign looking bureaucratic evidentiary requirements that are also adding on another layer to that process. And then another thought that connects this to the bigger project is that essentially I think your paper is really demonstrating well how the fortress has different impact and different implications for vulnerable communities, in your case, mostly women. And that kind of evidence that you are presenting in those cases is especially crucial in cases where the persecution is happening in a private sphere and is much more challenging to substantiate. And then maybe another sort of connection that you can make with the existing literature is to tie this with the discussions of how asylum seekers are portrayed as suspects and how the testimony is constantly devalued. And in that context, I would actually use a lot of caution, suggesting you need to rely on scientific evidence, because we do have so much experience with those, especially with the body-related evidence that is, allegedly scientific, but it's so heavily racialized. and is so selectively used. So I would caution relying on those scientific evidence, because I think a lot of times that they appear to be scientific, but the way that they are applied and used is actually not as objective as we would like to think.
Thank you. Professor Ardalan, would you like to respond?
Thank you. That was very helpful. And I think in particular, the point about scientific evidence and empirical evidence is one that I have struggled with, because I think that there is a movement in some ways in immigration law and in many spaces of law, criminal law, other areas to try to think about empirical evidence and more science-based evidence and how it can be useful. And I think this question of how it can, come back to bite you or actually reinforce problematic stereotypes and issues is often overlooked in that context. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Professor Rosenblum, you have a question.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to jump in, I guess, on this question, and maybe partly to respond to Sabi's question of, is there such a thing as generalizations that are not stereotypes, and then putting that kind of in conversation with Tali's comment. So I guess I'd start by saying, well, so yes, I think any of us who have any kind of, who read social science scholarship or produce any of it, I mean, I think we all have some belief that there's some interesting scholarship out there, or that, there's some journalism, social science, whatever it may be. But there is information about places that is nuanced, that is empirical, that is useful, that can support some of these claims. And I don't think we want to abandon that notion, right? It's a question of how do you navigate a system that doesn't deal well with complexity, right? I mean, there are some strange ways, for example, that that I think, intersectionality, for example, can be useful as a lens for a particular social group. You have to kind of, for particularity, to kind of zero in on a particular identity that might be a kind of a combination of different forms of oppression. But in general, this is a system that does not deal with complexity well. And so if you have, and doesn't understand that different people in a particular identity or group might be situated very differently. So, you have a client who's from a rural area in Mexico who is gay, and so you can see that, oh, well, look at all these, wealthy gay men living in Mexico City who are having gay pride marches, or, there's kind of these unitary notions of an identity, and you'll get the government raising these issues. Oh, we think everything's fine there. Look, or there's legal, there's laws on the books, right? There's laws on the books that protect domestic violence victims, but, kind of having to really dig into those issues. And I don't think there's any other way to do it besides mining that information that is out there. But I do think, Tali's point is a good one about, and I was a little bit what I was trying to get at, that kind of, I think it isn't just that there's sort of two categories. You may be a little, you limiting yourself, I think, by kind of thinking of it, there's stereotyped kind of information out there and non-stereotyped. In fact, there's sort of this, as I think I tried to say, this is a site of contestation always. These questions of what information you use, what are the gaps in it, who's producing it, what's its methodology, et cetera, is always going to be kind of part of this question. I didn't mention in my comments the Trump administration proposed reg, partly because it has been enjoined, and I'm not sure, it's a little bit of a hook, but it's really not the central part of your piece. But I would love to see you dig into that. I think that is a really interesting question. Clearly, the way it was intended was not in any useful way, right? It was intended really to mean no information about general attitudes at all. But I would love to see you kind of take that on in this piece.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I really appreciated your reflections on where country condition information comes from. And that history that you have in helping to produce information that ends up being used by other people. And so that was a really interesting perspective and insights that you brought to the table. I think it has been really interesting to track how, for example, even in State Department country reports, right, the evolution of the section that has been added around LGBTQ plus human rights violations and sort of the ebbs and flows and information in that section from the time that you first started doing this work until now, and same with the gender sections. I think I wanted to come back to one point that you made in your remarks that I think is something I would like to explore further, which is this question of, I think, what work can rethinking particular social group and how to define particular social group do to push back against this, as opposed to making the entire sort of burden of this being placed on issues of credibility and corroboration, right? Like what work could be done. So for example, if we were to revert to an understanding of particular social group under a US law that was only immutability, would this issue be solved, right? And is that a better solution even, or a more realistic solution potentially, given that regulations are in the making, we have a new administration, right? Is that the area to push, as opposed to trying to push on a different weight being given to asylum seekers' testimony, or different types of evidence being produced or invoked? And so I think that isn't something that I focused on it as much as I could going forward too.
Thank you. I have a question. It sort of follows up on Professor Rosenblum's question about the Trump administration. I mean, the rule was very much a political goal. And I guess my wider question, I'd love to hear more of your discussion, is, does addressing this at all play into, like, is there a good outcome from this, like discussing stereotypes, and the way of it can just have a negative impact and achieve the political goal from the beginning? So like, does engaging in this very instrumental use of stereotypes that the Trump administration does play into that political game?
So I think that's a really good question, and something that I have been worried about as I write about this now post-Trump administration, right? So this paper was obviously conceived of under the prior administration, and in trying to think things through under a regime that we're no longer operating under. The reason I think Professor Rosenblum is right, it really is just a hook, is because this is something that's been part and parcel of attention that's been part and parcel of asylum law forever. But right, are there any potential pitfalls to engaging in this conversation now under a new administration? I don't know. I guess I think as a scholar and as an advocate, that it's important for us to really sort of critique the system, even if I'm operating within it, right? And so to reflect on ways of pushing back or making the system such that it is operate in a way that doesn't end up vilifying people or keeping people out when it's supposed to protect people, right? And are there things that as scholars we can theorize, and as advocates we can do to try to really ensure that the system, to the limited extent that it can, provides as much protection as it can, as opposed to foreclosing people from protection because of what we're inadvertently doing.
Thank you. We don't have any other people on the queue. Are there any other people who would like to ask a question or discuss other points? This has been a really great conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you again to Professor Rosenblum for her comments, and Professor Adra Artelans, excuse me, for the paper, which was lovely. Shall I hand it back to Tali for final comments?
Yeah, I mean, people are welcome to hang around. I know that there are a lot of people who haven't seen each other in a very long time, and this is as close as it's going to get. So people are welcome to hang around until about noon. And for those of you who would like to get going, we will see you again tomorrow when we convene at noon. I do want to draw everyone's attention to the fact that we had a schedule change. So tomorrow we'll only have 2 papers instead of the planned 3. But looking forward to seeing everyone again tomorrow for a continued conversation around Fortress North America.
So we will start at 12, correct, Tali?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. So maybe we should stop recording and move to informal session. What do you think?
Sure.